Who created God? I get this question quite a bit, actually, and usually it comes from skeptics, but Christians have asked this question as well. And typically the question comes in the form of an objection. If God created everything, well, then who created God? And the idea is to suggest that classical monotheism, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever it might be, is incoherent, because if God created everything, well, then who created God? Now, the assumptions underlying this question are faulty, because they assume that classical monotheism, especially Christian monotheism, believes that God is a being amongst other beings, that he is the kind of being that other kinds of beings are. He's just more powerful or just older. When the reality is that's not how classical monotheism thinks of or conceives of who God actually is. Now, we think of the God of the Bible, Yahweh, for example, as something akin to Zeus or Artemis or Hermes or the Titans, and these kinds of things, when the reality is that the Bible doesn't describe, and classical monotheism generally does not describe God in this way. Those gods emerged from the ether, from an eternal ether that always existed. That's true of the Greek gods, that's true of the Babylonian gods and different gods of different cultures, where those gods have origin stories. They began to exist, usually from some kind of primordial ether or universe that pre-existed them. But that's not how God is defined in classical monotheism, and certainly not in the Bible. God always existed. He is an eternally existent being and has no cause, because he is the uncaused cause. Now, how does that make any kind of sense? Well, let's think about it for a moment. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was a philosopher who asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything rather than a universe or existence where there is nothing at all? Why does the universe itself even exist? And the argument is sophisticated, but it breaks down into these two categories. When you look at the universe around us, you have contingent things and you have necessary things. Things are either contingent or they're necessary. Well, what do we mean by this? A contingent thing is a thing or a being whose existence needs to be explained by something else. In other words, it was caused by something that pre-existed it in some way. I'm a contingent being. You're a contingent being. The surroundings I'm surrounded by are all contingent. The universe itself is contingent, because you can think of it either not existing or being different. So everything, most things, are contingent. They have an explanation for how they got here. But you can't have an infinite number of contingent things, because then you'd have to have an infinite number of causes that goes back and back and back. And that simply can't be the case. For example, if we had an infinite number of causes that go backwards into our past, we could never get to now. Think about your math class. You know, remember the number line you learned in math, where you have a 0, then a 1, then a 2, then a 3, and then you have from 0, you have a -1, a -2, a -3, and the line goes infinitely that way and infinitely back? Well, that's nice for mathematical uses, but it's not actually real in the practical sense or in the physical sense. Because if you had an infinite number of past events, then how could you ever start counting those events to get to now? You could never start, because it goes back infinitely. And yet here we are in the now. There is a now. You're watching this now. This moment could be 1 on the timeline. But if you're going back infinitely, you could never count to here. So you can't have an infinite number of things that happened in the past. You have to have a starting point. So the number of contingent beings, humans, animals, universes, planets, all this stuff, has to be limited. You can't have an unlimited amount. But here's the problem. If you have contingent beings that started somewhere, they can't be started by another contingent being, because that being needs to be explained too. So the thing that starts all things has to be what's called a necessary being. A necessary being is a being that has to exist. It never has a beginning. It always existed. And that's logically the way it works. All contingent things had to have a beginning. The thing can't be contingent that started everything, therefore it has to be a necessary being. Now, you can think of other candidates for necessary beings, like numbers, or concepts like love, or judgment, or compassion. But these ideas are just abstract ideas. They don't do anything. No one bumps into the number 7 and says, "Oh, pardon me, sir, I didn't see you there." Or, the idea of love doesn't actually do anything. It's just an idea. So those, even if they are necessary, even if they always exist, they don't have any causative abilities. They don't do anything. But God fits the bill perfectly. He is a being who always exists and has the ability to change things or to cause things or to create things. And so the idea of who created God is a category mistake, because we're not talking about, when we talk about God, the same kind of thing that needs to be created. Now, the Bible actually gives us warrant for this. The Bible actually predicts this in its very words. In fact, the opening line of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning of what? In the beginning of all contingent things. God already existed, he pre-existed as a necessary being to create all other things. One last bit about this, and this is one of the reasons why I really love the Bible, is because the beauty of its words speak to incredibly complex philosophies. The name of God. When Moses is in front of God at the burning bush and he doesn't know who God is, and God is saying, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to get the Israelites freed from their slavery, Moses says, who shall I say has sent me? What is your name? And God says, I am that I am. That is my name. I am that I am. Notice something in that? God's very name is about him being the necessary being who always is, and everything else exists because of him. The Bible, in just a simple name, summarizes a complex philosophical argument that shows that no one created God, but God exists and creates everything.